the four sides of each of the pillars. Those are copies of photography that won the National Audubon Award for this year. So there's 8 pictures up there, and then there's 1 picture on the sign that's on the easel. There are also Audubon magazines that are free, so if you don't have an Audubon magazine at home, the center portion of the magazine has each of the winning photographs and the story behind it, where it was taken and how it was taken and what it represents. Also, at the end, there will be refreshments tonight, and Patty Marlette has a brief introduction and award for now.
Well, as you know, if you've read the newsletter, Sean Silliman has been with us for 25 years now. And so we asked him to come tonight so we could give him a certificate of appreciation. And the refreshments are going to be a cake to celebrate Sean's 25 years.
And I just want to say thanks for this certificate, and I was telling some of my board members earlier that I felt like I should almost be thanking Wichita Audubon Society for giving me this opportunity to do something that I really love for the last 25 years. It's been a wonderful experience for me, and they say, you know, if you do something that you love, you never work a day in your life, and for me that was true. So I really appreciate everything that Audubon has done for me over the years as well. So thank you very much.
Welcome everybody, I'm Mark Nolan.
Mark, can I say something?
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm the Carol Cumberland, the membership chair, and I have, if you're not a member of Wichita Audubon, we would love to have you join. It's $20 for an individual and $25 for a family. If you need, this is our calendar of events. If you need a calendar of events, I have one for you as well. Anybody need one now? And there's a nice handy membership guide on the back.
Thank you.
Oh, here you go.
So I'm Vice President and Program Chair for Wichita Audubon, and to introduce Dr. Alice Boyle tonight. She currently is at Kansas State University. She hails from Winnipeg, Canada, originally, and has lived and traveled throughout the Americas. Has worked for many years in very wet tropical forests before coming to Kansas. She joins the faculty at Kansas State 10 years ago and has devoted much of her efforts to studying birds in tallgrass prairies in eastern Kansas. She teaches ornithology and mentors many graduate and undergraduate students in avian research. And Dr. Boyle is fascinated by bird movements. So the title of the talk tonight, Kansas Flyways, Current and Future of Understanding Bird Movements, including their local migration and tropical birds and dispersal and grassland birds. So birds are constantly moving. Where are they going? We don't always know. And she and her students have discovered some unusual movements that our local birds engage in. And those might affect practically everything about their ecology and their conservation. So we have a great talk tonight about ornithological science, to learn something about what the birds are doing out there. Welcome.
Just a little disclaimer there, if you're expecting tropical bird stuff, not happening tonight. You'll have to come invite me another time. Today I'm going to talk about Kansas and my love affair with the Kansas birds. And what we have a tiny bit about what we've done. Don't worry, there's no figures. Actually, there's one figure, but it's easy. And then where we're going from here. So, you know, this is the view of Kansas, of most people in North America, if they come to Kansas at all. It's often on I-70, and this is what it looks like, and you can see how much they would get out of that visit to Kansas from their car window. If they maybe don't even drive across the country, this is what it looks like if they're lucky to fly low enough. Otherwise, they just see sort of a patchwork of fields below them. And as a consequence, the reputation of Kansas is this drive-by, fly-by country. And I have to admit that I didn't realize just what it was like until I came here and I stepped out of a car and I started walking around the prairies and was just mind blown by what we have out here, especially in our grassland systems. And of course, it completely destroyed all the stereotypes. You know, it's definitely not flat. If you do field work here, you know that intimately. Your bone muscles know that. It's not all grass. It's full of these beautiful flowering plants of many kinds, and insects and herps, and of course the birds. It's got really exciting weather, and it's constantly changing. So in every season, it's got this amazing beauty. Winter, spring, summer. And I did not have any idea about that, even though I grew up at the northernmost extent of the tallgrass prairie biome in Winnipeg, Canada, 800 and something miles due north of here. And that's me as a little kid. And growing up, my sole experience of prairie, growing up in Winnipeg, that's completely surrounded by wheat fields and canola fields, was this one little postage stamp, I think probably 1 by 1 mile square, I'm not quite sure, in the middle of the city called the quote unquote living prairie, which completely unprepared me for what was going to happen when I moved here. And I was faced with what real prairie is like, at least the Flint Hills, at least the prairies, tallgrass prairies of the Central Great Plains. So I'm going to start with just a little bit about why Kansas is special to me as a birder. And ultimately that gets down to sort of distribution and movement. So one of the cool things is that distributionally we're at this crossroads of, hey, chickadees. I didn't warn you there's going to be a chickadee picture in here. Oh, I didn't even, that's the next slide. Okay, not here. Okay, east-west, meadowlarks. We're at the junction of that. In Manhattan, I can go to native prairies where I see eastern meadowlarks, ag fields where I get western meadowlarks. And we get all these lovely species pairs. Okay, what do we got here, everybody? Let's make sure you're awake. Phoebes, sades and eastern, bluebirds, yeah, eastern, western, buntings. Yeah, and some of these have gone back and forth between being considered a whole species or subspecies or whatever. However you divide your taxonomy, we're at this junction, we're at this crossroad, these boundaries between eastern and western, which makes it cool. And here's the chickadee slide, sorry about that. I knew it was coming up. We're also at northern-southern boundaries. Chickadees are a great example, but there are others, of course. So distributionally, it's cool. We get to sample from these different avifaunas. But the movement, I think, is what makes it cooler. So we get huge influxes of water birds on like geese and ducks and stuff in the winter. They're coming down the Mississippi and Central Flyways. A little bit on the eastern edge of this state, we get these a little bit of the Mississippi Flyway and some of the great eastern warblers that I always feel jealous of other birders in Kansas City in the spring because of this. In the middle of the country, of course, middle of the state, we get the amazing aggregations of cranes, and we're going to celebrate that in a month or so. And shorebirds, I mean, world important, globally important stopover areas for these things. And then, of course, we get very special winter avifauna. We have these winter visitors like Harris's sparrows, where pretty much, you know, their entire world population winters in this small area of eastern Kansas and northern Oklahoma. And these northern visitors come to us from very far north in some cases, and we're starting to learn things like how site faithful these birds are. We ban them in the winter, we find them coming back to the same little patches year after year, which is incredible when you think about the fact that some of them nested on the shores of the Arctic Ocean in the summertime in between. And we finally even get some east-west movements like prairie falcons that spread out eastward during the winter. And we know almost nothing about those kinds of migrations. Really, more what I'm here to tell you about is why I like Kansas from the perspective of an ornithologist. And we talked a little bit about how those are overlapping but distinct things at dinner time. So I'm a birder, but I'm also an ornithologist. And sometimes I do more of one, and sometimes I do more of the other. And the reasons why I think it's a great place to be an ornithologist overlap in some ways. So distributionally, Kansas is at a really cool place. It's in the middle of the Central Great Plains, this huge biome that it dominates the middle part of certainly the United States, but also Canada and northern Mexico. And it's at this crossroads there of long rainfall gradients. So we get really wet prairie biomes to the east end of the state and very dry ones on the west side. It is one of the last places where you can actually see functioning, semi-functioning anyway, tall grass prairies. So this map on the left here shows in pale green all the places where a tall grass prairie used to be. And the dark green is a kind of an optimistic view of where we still have tall grass prairie. I'm afraid it is being lost at alarming rates still. So distributionally, it's very cool, but one of the things that makes this avifauna particularly important to me, one of the reasons why I am not just a tropical biologist anymore, but have this split personality between being a grassland biologist and a tropical biologist, is the fact that our grassland birds are the most imperiled group of birds in North America. More species are declining than in any other biome proportionally. Their absolute numbers are decreasing more rapidly. Huge numbers of those are on the brink of really just not being around for the next generation unless some pretty dramatic stuff happens. Here's the one chart, not too threatening here. You can see how grassland birds, these birds in the beige in the bottom, by proportion of species, that little pie chart there, 3/4 of the species are declining, and the percent changed since 1970. So 50 years ago, well within the lifetimes of many of us, on average 50% declines in the abundance of individuals. So we have half as many birds in grassland systems as we did when I was born. And that is shocking. So I have devoted much of the last 10 years to studying those birds, and the breeding grassland birds in eastern Kansas anyway are really special from a movement perspective as well. One way is that they connect us to the rest of the world. So for instance, grasshopper sparrows here, which will feature in some of the future slides, one of my favorite summer birds, one that I spent a lot of time working on. They migrate down to the grasslands of northern Mexico. Our birds go and hang out in sort of high, cold desert grasslands of Chihuahua and Coahuila primarily. Others breeding in the same shrub, adjacent shrub to the grass patch the sparrow's in, dick thistles, everybody's, well, maybe not so favorite summer bird. I personally, well, we won't go there. I don't really care for dick thistles that much, but because they're so loud. But anyway, they do a very cool migration thing. They skip over those desert grasslands. They skip over the subtropics. They skip over Central America and go to something that looks kind of vaguely like the Everglades in northeastern South America. And they actually become agricultural pests there. And then there's other birds that just nest up on the hilltop, upland sandpipers, that just skip over the entire tropics. They cross major bodies of water. They cross the Andes twice. They make these unbelievably energetically costly movements, and go to temperate grasslands in the southern cone, in Argentina and southern Brazil and Uruguay. And so those movements and the fact that these birds do so many different things, even one's bird potentially breeding within one small patch, is kind of amazing. The kinds of movement, I'm fascinated by those movements, but the kinds of movements that I think are most important and sort of least known that I've focused on have been much shorter distance. And those are I'm just going to give you a couple of little tidbits, a couple of little highlights of some of the work that I and my students have done over the past 10 years related to the movements of some of our local grassland dependent birds. So one, I told you grasshopper sparrows would come back. One is that grasshopper sparrows, this bird here, potentially one of the most common grassland dependent species if given the right habitat. We think about, okay, how many are there this year, how many are there next year? When people notice, ooh, there aren't as many this year as there were last year, or there's a lot more, and they think about, oh, maybe last year was a really good year and they had lots of babies, or maybe it was a bad year, it was drought last year, and so like there wasn't as good reproduction, and so we don't have as many adults. Well, we figured out after a lot of field work, let me tell you, a lot of field work, that how many birds there are from one year to the next in a given local area here has basically nothing to do with how many babies those birds had the previous year. Because over 80% of the individuals that come back to one patch, or come to a patch to breed in a given year, are coming from somewhere quite far away. Potentially 80, 100 kilometers away. And only about 20% are the ones that bred there the last year. And we know that they don't all die, because we'll ban them, we'll call a ban, we'll monitor them, we look really, really, really hard for these birds. And we'll see them repeatedly in a season, then we won't see them for like a year, or 2 years, or sometimes 3 or 4 years, and then they come back. So we know they lived. We're pretty sure they weren't at the site in between. They bred somewhere else and they came back. And so the abundance of how many birds are in a given spot in a given year has everything to do with how many choose to disperse here, either come back to where they've been before, or new birds coming in. And it's that decision, that dispersal decision, that is really the most important thing about their demography. And that's a really important insight for anybody concerned about land management, right? Because you want to monitor what you do and figure out whether that's effective, and whether or not it's effective is really only going to matter as long as it brings birds back and brings birds in from other locations. The other absolutely amazing part of this story is that how many birds come back or come in from elsewhere has a lot to do, not everything, but has a lot to do with how much it rained, not last year, but the year before. And we're still sort of trying to figure out all the mechanisms that potentially lead to, but we think it's related to the vegetation. And we think that the vegetation is mediating all this stuff, like whether a bird thinks it's a good place to be or not. And that good place to be really is dependent on having the right mix of places to nest and forage, and it's very particular. Grassland birds tend to be very particular about the structure of the vegetation, and each species likes something a little bit different. And so for grasshopper sparrows, we think they're cueing in on something that happened the year before, and that's affecting the production of the vegetation, the structure of that habitat, in a way that matters, kind of a surprising amount for this, for their movement, their behavior. Okay, another big project we had was on Henslow sparrows, and taking sort of a much bigger sort of landscape perspective and working over the entire eastern third of the state. And this bird's another one that's really fascinating from a movement perspective, because they being termed nomadic. And my take on the word nomadic is basically that we don't know what they do, and so we call them nomadic. We can't predict it, so we call it nomadic. I mean, it's the catch-all for like random stuff that we can't explain yet. And so it turns out that if that's your definition of nomadic, they aren't nomadic, because we can actually start to now explain where and why they go to the places they do. And we know a lot about the habitat characteristics and the patches that they select, and the fact that they hate trees like many grassland birds, and they go to really big patches, and they'll move from smaller patches to bigger patches during the year. And we can now make some pretty good predictions about where and how many Henslow sparrows are going to be in a given place at a given time, and that's again really important for their conservation, obviously. The third thing I want to tell you about is that I think is potentially one of the coolest things that I've discovered in the past decade, and that's that we kind of knew that there was this dispersal between years, that like at least in the Great Plains other people had reported low return rates, and we thought, okay, dispersal is important. And but the first year I went out, I worked at Kanza down the street from University, K-State, and I banded a whole bunch of birds, and I put these unique color band combinations on their legs so we could go and look at where they were later and monitor their nest success and blah, 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 blah. And so we go and band these birds, and we go and survey them every 10 days. And pretty soon, we noticed that some birds that we banded were showing up somewhere else, and other birds that we hadn't banded were appearing in those same areas that the banded birds have been, even within the same season. And so this became sort of trying to figure out these decision rules about, first of all, what are the patterns, how far are they going, where are they going, why are they going, became a project that one of my first master's students took on. And we found that that movement, kind of unsurprisingly, is related to whether or not their nest success. And of course, these grassland birds get hammered by predators. So a lot of them do move, and they're more likely to do so after their nests have been eaten by snakes. But another really cool thing is that dispersal works. So they're tending to go relatively smaller distances. We're talking on the order of like 5 to 10 kilometers, if that, many of them shorter. And when they make those dispersal movements, they're actually able to improve their nest success. They have less predation, and they have less brood parasitism. Whereas the ones that stay put have kind of equal chances as they did in their first nests. And so there's a reason for them to make those movements, which is really gratifying. As an ecologist, we're always looking for why birds do these things, So those are just three sort of little vignettes, little highlights, little tasters for some of the work that we've done on these grassland birds and their movement. But there's still so much we don't know. And I kind of got to the point with a lot of the work that I was doing at Kanza, where it's like, okay, I could keep going, I could keep doing this stuff, but I've done it for 10 years, and the stuff I want to know now requires a different scale of understanding of movement and a different approach. And so what do we have available? What are the tools out there for us? Well, one of the tools is eBird, and I hope you all, who's an eBirder here? Anybody? Oh yes, good. Well, those who aren't, I know it foments sort of the competitive aspect of birding, which many of us choose to not engage in, but try to just do it anyway. It's an awesome tool. It's something designed for birders, and it works for birders, but it also has this amazingly great side benefit, that is that we can use all that data as scientists to learn about so many things that you wouldn't necessarily think. And one of the cool things that, one of the cool data products that they've come out with, which they're constantly producing stuff, is these animated projected distribution maps. And I'm sure you're all mesmerized by the upland sandpiper distribution. Notice how it just goes blank for a while as they cross over. I think that's amazing. Anyway, eBird is a great tool, but there's some issues, right? We don't learn anything about individuals there. We learn things about the species as a whole. We don't even get subspecies kinds of information out of this. And so much of what we want to know about bird movement is dependent on understanding what individuals do. Their decision-making process, the stuff that affects where they go, how they go, when they go, that sort of thing, whether they make it. So, no individual level data. Another great tool is bird banding, and I would encourage any of you who, if you've never been out banding, find someone to go out with. It's a thrill of a lifetime to let a wild bird go. Bring your kids, bring your grandkids. I run a banding effort in the winter. I'm sure there are other people closer to you that could offer that opportunity. And banding has been going on for a long time, well over a century. Individually numbered bands on the legs of birds, and it has provided a huge amount of information, especially with species that are hunted, because those tend to get those bands tend to get recovered quite a lot. But for the most of them, we get relatively low return rates, and it's very labor intensive. And so you might get quite a few of the birds that you banded back at your site, but for the chances of a bird that you band be captured by somebody else is extremely low, I'm afraid. So limited amount of data for the amount of effort it requires. Another tool that I've used is stable isotopes, and this is a really cool thing because there are natural gradients across the landscape of these isotopes that are versions of like carbon or hydrogen or oxygen that are heavier. And they don't break down like radioisotopes. They're stable in the landscape and they vary predictably in space. This is a stable hydrogen isotope map up there on the top right. And what happens is that when birds are eating, or any animal, are eating, you're incorporating into the tissues that you're growing a chemical signature of the ratio of the normal isotope to the heavy isotope in the foods that you or the bird are eating. And so a bird eating in an area with a high ratio of deuterium, say, to hydrogen, like in the red area there in the map, it's going to have a higher ratio of that heavy isotope in its feathers as it's growing those feathers. But the great thing about birds is that one of the great things, there's so many great things, but one of the great things is that those feathers, when they're growing, they're fed by blood, and the blood is depositing in the feather tissue that signature, that isotopic signature. But then once the feather's grown, there's no more blood supply. And so it's cut off from new changes in isotopic signature, which means that you can pluck a feather, an old feather on this bird here, molting in, say, August, September. And it's molting these new feathers. Those new feathers are incorporating the isotopic signature of the place it bred because they molt on their breeding grounds. And I do have a pointer. Use it. Here we go. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, there we go. So breeding, they molt on the breeding grounds, and so these old feathers were molted on their old breeding grounds. And then they migrate, they winter, they migrate again, and they come to some new place to breed. And bingo, those old feathers gave us hints about where the bird was at the time when it molted its feathers. And different isotopes and different tissues are deposited at different times, and so it's a really powerful tool to get sort of a big picture of where a bird was over time. The drawbacks are, though, that it's relatively low spatial resolution. So although we can learn things about individuals, we just kind of have this blob of area on the map that we think the bird was when it molted those feathers. On small scales, we can do radiotelemetry, handheld radiotelemetry, old school wildlife biology, where we track birds around, we triangulate, we find where they are, mark that location, do that multiple times. This is one of my students tracking juveniles, who wanted to know about juvenile survival. They all ended up in, all the radio transmitters ended up in snakes underground, by the way. But the problem with radio transmitters is that it's short range, again, very labor intensive, and we can't get it sort of regional scale. Finally, there are fancy tags like satellite tags that can give us absolute phenomenal information about individuals over time and high resolution locations, high resolution time, movement, multiple years. Very, very, very cool. I'm very jealous because you can only put these on like big birds and you have to have a lot of money, and neither of which applies to me. So I've been sort of waiting for the right technology, and it has happened. So enter what's called the Modus network. This is it's a network of automated telemetry receiver stations. So that picture of my student holding the antenna is just like that, except that there are antennas mounted in locations and listening all the time, just listening for birds. And the birds that it's listening for are any birds that are carrying these digitally coded tags that emit distinctive signals. And so every bird has a unique code. Anytime a bird flies within 10 miles-ish line of sight of one of those antennae, the receiver station there says, I hear you. I'm going to record that you were here at this time for this location, this many minutes, this long, on this day, and I'm going to send an email to Alice. And that is like amazing. And so I've known about this technology since it started. It actually started, okay, here's how it works. You get the tagged birds, you have the station, you have a bunch of electronics that do all the magic and send you the information and either upload it by a cell thing, or if there's Wi-Fi nearby, you can use that. I've known about this since it started because I was a postdoc in London, Ontario, when my colleagues in my lab had the cool idea to do this. And at the time I thought it was amazing, but gosh, I'm not working in Southern Ontario. So every yellow dot on there is a receiver station, and you can see they're plastered over Southern Ontario. Over time, it moved from sort of being really focused on that zone to it on the East Coast, and then spreading across to a few more places further north, along the Gulf Coast, Florida, that sort of thing. And now, this is a map of the current receivers 2 weeks ago, and you can see that still mostly Western Hemisphere, but we're getting a lot more down in Central and South America and Mexico. It's starting to catch on in Europe, a few in Australia, and before long, I predict there'll be many more yellow dots in many other parts of the world. In the Great Plains, however, it's been a bit of a blank spot. So this is 2017, none whatsoever. 2018, just a few little dots there in Oklahoma, mostly. It's not getting much better. 2019, in 2020, we got a bunch in Missouri. That was exceptional efforts of the Missouri Department of Conservation. And then suddenly 2021, we start to see a few more in the Great Plains, and that is largely due to the efforts of the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, because they hired somebody to develop Modus in the Great Plains. And in 2021, they installed 11 receiver stations in Kansas, including a couple at Cheyenne Bottoms, one at Quivira, and a few in other places, one at the Conza Prairie where I work, and Tallgrass Prairie, one down near Pittsburgh, El Dorado, and because there was the beginnings of this infrastructure in Kansas, and have to start from scratch, I thought, okay, this is what we need. this is what is going to help us to understand these regional movements of our grassland-dependent species. And so with a couple of other colleagues at Pitt State, Andrew George and Bill Jensen at Emporia, we sort of founded this little coalition of Kansas Motus, and we don't have a logo yet, so there's just words. With the help of Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, we got trained in how to build these things, how to install them. We had our first, we had a training workshop, we had an installation at, believe it or not, the Emerald City. Isn't that perfect for Kansas Motus? Our first installation was on this absolutely marvelous folk art structure in the middle of a field with very good visibility. There was like a Aeolian harp here, and like there's Dorothy and the Tin Man and a tornado, other folk art structures out there in the pasture. It's quite cool. But anyway, this is a triumph. It was a privately funded private ranch, and we have been doing talks like this and fundraising in other ways, and talking to the zoos and talking to KDWP and trying to get momentum for our vision to build out this network in eastern Kansas, in particular in Kansas, the whole state, but particularly in eastern Kansas. So as of right now, the maroon pins there are all the places where there is a functional receiver station, all collecting data right now. All the orange dots are places where people, either us or other people, have said, hey, we got money, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do it here. So those are basically done deals, and we have been prioritizing other locations, talking to landowners, looking for ways to get those other places installed. And already these stations are collecting some really cool data. One of the amazing things about Motus is that it's by nature collaborative. So any receiver station anywhere in the network can detect anybody else's bird, and all that information gets centrally stored and shared. And so all of the work we do will also benefit from any of the other installations anywhere else in the globe. But in the meantime, I want to show you this one particular little example of a cool thing. So last April, my friend Ariel Fournier tagged this bird in Illinois, this Virginia rail, and it hung around the tagging site for a few weeks, and then started making its migration north, and we lost sight of it as it sort of got out of the range of where there were stations in Saskatchewan in early June, probably bred up in the Boyle forest over the summer, and nobody had heard anything from that bird for a little while until late September. It was detected first at the Kanza Prairie, then at the new installation at the Flint Hills National Wildlife Refuge, and then a week after installing the Emerald City, it flew by that tower on its way further south. And one of the things that's so special to me is that a friend of mine held this bird. I mean, I just think there's very little cooler about that kind of intimate knowledge of birds as individuals, and knowing things about the timing, the location of those migration routes. And we're seeing a surprising number of birds from pretty far northwest part of the continent migrating on their way south through the eastern edge of the tallgrass prairie, which to my knowledge is kind of a novel insight about those migratory programs. So I think there's so much to learn there on the bigger scale, even independent from the stuff that we want to learn. So our vision is to get receiver stations all over, to have co-tagging efforts and collaborative research projects within the state, and expand this into sort of a more integrated educational and outreach platform for the state to get more people interested in birds, and therefore hopefully interested in doing things that helps keep our birds from going extinct, because that is what is gonna happen if we don't make big changes. So our vision is to get a receiver station in every county in eastern Kansas. This is what we got so far. These are some of our highest priority locations. Our next highest priority locations, active conversations with landowners, with funding entities, and that is requiring most of my attention on this project right now. But once we feel like we've gotten at least a critical mass of receiver stations, then doing these tagging efforts to learn about these movements is going to be really important. And there's many research questions, multiple species that I would like to tackle. But I think training, co-training graduate students from different institutions within the state is a tremendous opportunity to provide that kind of experience, and also to all help each other in a way that is good for everyone. I think there's huge opportunity to build educational materials. I mean, somewhere like the Great Plains Nature Center here, I mean, it would be amazing to have an exhibit, an interpretive display about MODIS that you could look at real time, like what birds are being detected in different places and where they came from. You can access all that information on the MODIS site really easily, visualize that on maps. Great way to get people involved is showing them how we do that, putting the tags on the birds and showing them that kind of effort. I really enjoy that part of the work, and I think it's a tremendously important part of my job as well, is not just doing the science, but also making sure that people hear about it and learn from what we're learning. So what will this do? What if we get one of those receiver stations in every county in eastern Kansas? Here are just a few of the examples. One thing it will let us do is learn more about the space use of some of our most threatened species, like prairie chickens. We know where they are on leks, we know a little bit about where the females go, and we know relatively little about what happens to them at other times of the year, how much they move around, how much they use other habitats, the distances traveled, the landscapes they move through, that sort of thing. It will allow us to figure out at an even better level than I've been able to do, not through complex analytical methods, but by direct tracking how much of these movements, how much of the abundance is coming of individuals coming from relatively short areas, distances, or long distances. Birds like Kenzo sparrows and grasshopper sparrows. It'll help us figure out some of the basic natural history about movement for some of our local species that we don't know. For instance, sedge-wrens. Where we are, they are absent for the whole early part of the breeding season and show up kind of late July, early August, when most things are finished breeding and they establish territories and sing their hearts out and do that considerably later in the season. And people think that they have two completely discrete breeding areas in the continent, one further north, and then they come down here and have a second one. And people have not been able to pin that down and do it because of technology. This is technology that can do it. Another thing is, you'd think we know everything about eastern meadowlarks, right? But we actually don't. Their breeding ranges and non-breeding ranges overlap here, so we have meadowlarks year-round. We don't know if it's the same birds that stay, and more notably birds hopscotch, or whether everybody moves a little bit further south, and our breeding birds are replaced by other ones. It'll help us resolve some of these bigger picture patterns about movement natural history as well. So those are just some of the examples. What's it going to take? We already got the national and international partnerships, because MODIS is inherently a grassroots collaborative of people who want to learn about movement. Statewide, we're working on these partnerships. We've got definitely multiple academic institutions. We've got the buy-in from TNC. We're working on hopefully in the future getting state funding. We're working on gaining as many sort of collaborations. The Kansas zoos are really interested in this and interested in the outreach aspect of the education aspect. And I would say the opportunities for a group like you are that potentially you could have a locally funded station, although I will say that Sedgwick County is in good shape right now because McConnell Air Force Base has installed one and the Sedgwick County Zoo wants to install one as well. Potentially there might be people out there interested in funding a station, or potentially just funding a tag because those costs add up as well. Or not, maybe you want to help us organize some field trips or some like event where you bring people to see capturing or tagging or something like that. So I'm open to any kind of engagement, involvement that you all can come up with and want to be involved in. It's important for conservation, and I know I've said this a number of times, but I'm going to reiterate it. When we think about a bird like this meadowlark, or even more so a bird like a grasshopper sparrow that's we know migrates, this is a very simplified diagram of the things that affect its demography over the year. There's mortality during migration, there's breeding dispersal, it relates to habitat quality, there's weather, the weather matters a lot. There are all these local processes, regional processes, continental processes, they all feed in. And unless we know how, where, and when these birds are moving, this is a very intractable problem. But it becomes a lot easier if we can pin down this movement angle. So that's all I got for you, and I would be delighted to answer any questions you may have. Yes?
How many how many birds have been tagged?
Oh, globally?
No, just in the United States.
Ooh, very, very good question. And I don't have an exact number for you.
Ballpark?
Ballpark, I would say, tens of thousands. But not evenly distributed taxonomically. So people tend to have projects, like we've gotten a whole bunch of, say, Swenson's thrush detections and black tern detections at Kanza, and it's because there's somebody working on black terns and she put on a lot of tags on black terns, and so we're detecting them, So it's not evenly distributed. It's not like there's some central entity saying, hey, we need to know more about this, so you all go out and do that. It's each individual researcher addressing the questions that they have individually. And so it's a little spotty that way, but it is growing rapidly. This is a technology that's taking off exponentially, and more people are using this technology.
How hard is it to tag them?
Easy.
What about a big bird eating a little bird? What happens to the tag?
Goes inside the big bird.
Will the big bird carry it around and,
That's a really good, until it poops, yeah, probably.
So.
Yes.
What does it cost to establish a station?
The cost of the station is dependent in part on what existing infrastructure is there. And so we have costed sort of everything from the ideal situation where there's already some sort of structure that we can use, like an old power pole or maybe an old windmill, or I'm actually talking to the mesonet people, the climatologists, because they've got all these fabulous little towers all over the place. Tower, power, Wi-Fi. If you got those three things, the hardware costs about $5,000. The installation costs another $1,000, and we are adding $1,000 for maintenance for the network, because once we install these, we want to be able to guarantee to people that they will be functional for at least 10 years. And so when we're talking to people about costs, we're saying between $7,000 and $11,000. Yes?
Wichita Audubon Society owns the Chaplin Nature Center in Cowley County.
That would be awesome. That would be very, very awesome. I will also mention that there are grants available from the National Audubon for local chapters to do projects such as that, and I'd be happy to help with such a proposal, and we'd be happy to do the installation for you. Yes.
If you're looking for locations, I mean, are you looking for the top of a hill in a valley? Are you looking for, what about, the whirling birds, the
Windmills?
The wind generator.
Yeah.
What about, I mean, what's the proximity?
So this is, every site's like a little puzzle, as I'm finding. Yes, top of the hill, because it is line of sight. So if you put it in a valley, then you aren't gonna get very far. However, I'm very cognizant of putting more tall structures on the landscape on the top of the hill is exactly what many of our grassland birds don't want. And so I'm all about using existing structures or piggybacking on other infrastructure that's already there, partly for cost, but partly because it minimizes, more disturbance. So I personally am looking for places with decent grassland in the area, decent view shed, and then as many of those, pros and cons then become what structures there already and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's complex. But I mean, from our perspective, it really matters that we are sampling, that we actually have a chance of detecting grassland birds in the grasslands. And so it's lovely that there is a station at McConnell Air Force Base. I'm not sure whether that really is that much value to for our research questions, but undoubtedly it's going to be important for the bigger network. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering about the wind turbines.
The wind turbines,
I mean, not as an installation site, but just,
how much it affects them.
Yeah.
I wouldn't go and put it in the middle of a wind turbine field, but I would say as long as you're a couple miles away, I wouldn't fuss about that. In fact, the Youngmeyer Ranch, you all familiar with that? Wichita State was gifted this property as a research station in Butler County, or as a research site, and they built this beautiful new little facility to do research there, and it's quite close to some wind farm, but I don't think that's going to matter. I think it'll be okay. Yeah.
Just thought I was told by a famous ornithologist many years ago that hundreds or thousands of sedge wrens had been banded, and there had never been a single recovery of a banded sedge wren ever.
I would totally believe that. Yeah, that's the same. I personally have banded, well, I and my students have banded almost 4,000 grasshopper sparrows, and nobody's ever caught any of them. Again, I mean, we have, but nobody's caught them away from our sites. Yeah. If anybody has for sedge wren, it's gonna be, you can count on one hand probably. And that's the thing, like some birds are easy to recapture, and others just don't. And so there's very little passive nest netting in the central part of the continent, and the passive nest netting that there is tends to be in, it's not getting the grassland birds all that well, it's not sampling all that well, yeah.
How expensive are the Modus tags, and is there the potential that Modus tags will eventually replace bird banding as we know it?
The tags themselves currently cost about $200. I would say that it won't replace banding because I don't know anybody who wouldn't also put a band on the leg of a bird when they tagged it. Partly, like if that bird does get recaptured by you or somebody else and it doesn't have a tag on it, you want to know that it lost a tag. It's information. We learn things about through bird banding locally. Like even the fact that we don't catch the birds elsewhere doesn't diminish the value of knowing that we've caught the same bird before at our local site. And so, for instance, the winter banding that I do, we use that to understand overwinter survival, interannual variation in survival, through capturing and recapturing the same individuals. So I don't think it'll go away, but I don't think there's too many people who are really thinking that bird banding is the way to go to learn about movement anymore. It's still useful for other things, not movement so much. Anyone else? Yeah.
Are the MODIS tags something that people have only been using like in the last 10 or 15
Yeah.
years? They're not, because they're digital in some ways, they identify that.
Right. With old school telemetry, each bird or each animal that you tag had its own unique frequency, and so you had to switch between frequencies to find those birds. These are all transmitting on the same frequency. Well, actually, there are two frequencies, which is why I won't go back. But if you see a picture of one of the stations, there are small antennae at the top and big antennae just below it, and those are receiving at different frequencies, two different brands of tags, two different frequencies. But within that brand, they're all on the same channel, they're just digitally coded. Yeah. Yes?
Is the data collected by the MODIS system available to see, right, and also secondly, is it somehow tied or associated any way with eBirds so that you can see clusters of birds moving here or there in real time?
We'll ask the eBird people to make that their next feature. Currently not, but I would not be surprised if they don't do that soon. So the first question is, are the data available to anyone? And for the most part, yes. However, individual researchers can set the visibility of the data that either for their own tag birds or for the stations that they manage. And so some people who are, say, doing their masters on a particular thing, they'll want their data scooped by somebody else and somebody else to write a paper about set trends when they were working on set trends. And so there may be like a period before which all of it is visible, but it does eventually all become visible. Yes. One thing that does use MODIS data that you may have seen in recent weeks, Audubon came up with this cool sort of, I forget what it's called, like something like, you're nodding, do you remember what it's called? The migration sort of connector or something. So for every spot on the map, you can find out what species have been connected to different areas, and MODIS data feeds into that for sure. So it's being used at a bigger scale to show people about movement of birds in their area, and it's Migration Explorer, maybe. I think that might be what it's called. Yeah, it's quite new, just a few weeks old, and it takes in multiple streams of movement data, and MODIS is one of those. Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Come join us for cake.
Move into the other room.